Hello and welcome back to Brim's documentation. This time we're going to be taking a look at this view right here, which has a ton of components in it. It's not necessarily complicated, it just has a lot going on in it. Just a lot of stuff. And this is encapsulated by the patient info page with data and the specimen info page with data, which of course has aliquot that are being rendered underneath as well. All of these components are on specimen page by ID, and just to show you how much we're working with down below, I did a quick ls to show you all of the various components that are at play. All of these are wrapped together in the patient info page with data, the specimen info page with data, passing patient ID for both, because patient is the top level object, specimen are associated with the patient. Again, patient could be a cadaver or an animal or whatever you're drawing specimen from. I'm sure there's another option out there that I'm not thinking of, maybe a plant, whatever. So this specimen page by ID is what is wrapping all of that together in a grid. So really quick, if we take a look at the patient info pane, we want to look at the patient info pane. Is it with data? No, patient info pane. What's being extracted is patient info pane with data down here below as a higher order component. And I actually did the props validation right there, good for me. So let's take a look what's happening here. So first of all, we have the toggles, and what this is this is all the preparatory stuff for this here, and system source, and eventually that's going to have functional mutations. That's where I will place those mutations once I'm ready to put them in. You have, of course, the dimmer, and again, if you're wondering what the dimmer is, it's from Semantic UI React, and it's that little spinny thing you saw right there when it's loading. Error state, haven't implemented just because I haven't run into issues with errors yet. The initial address card, which is this here, that's what that view is. Patient ID, props ID, address book, so on and so forth. And system source looks like it's trying to draw on a system source. I don't have a system source associated with this. I need to fix this right here to define the proper system source out of the props that are being injected, or out of the GraphQL call that's being injected through. I might have to adjust my backend GraphQL item. This is all of the iconography stuff that's happening on the right, which is just a placeholder for the moment. I'm thinking of changing this up in the near future. And all of this is in a generalized container that, again, is getting dumped into it, just pulling a lot of the patient data for this top panel. So that's everything that's happening in the patient info panel. It's basically just this being displayed, some placeholder stuff eventually for those mutations to work, some toggle stuff so that this can happen, toggle, and then a little bit of holder data on the right that is pseudo-functional. Then on the opposite, or down below, we have another, info pane. There we go. We have a lot of stuff happening here. So first of all, we're going to wrap everything out, calling specimen info pane with data. But inside specimen info pane with data, just so you know what is happening here, we've got a build panes, which is being called, and what is happening within that function is it's building these panes here, because you can see, depending on which specimen you want to look at, you've got the specimen information and the aliquot associated with that specimen. And I actually am pretty proud of this view because I feel like it's very clear as what's happening on, what's going on. One downside of this is I should eventually create some logic if there's so many specimen that this visually becomes untenable. But I think for at least smaller trials, this is usually going to be okay. I might have some logic to convert this to a dropdown eventually, but for the moment, I think it is operational. But basically, we're just mapping through, I'm going to close this bottom panel because we don't need it anymore. So what is happening is we're pulling back all of the specimen that are associated with the patient. We're just mapping through to build the panes, quote unquote, and pushing them through. And you can see the tabs are the panes here below, and there's also the add specimen modal, which is this down below, which is being called. That is imported from another function. Let's go ahead and, actually I should have left it open. Brim serves me right. Components and the specimen, where are we? Layout specimen. And then let's take a look at the add specimen modal. The add aliquot modal will look somewhat similar. Here we're actually doing a compose down below because we're actually adding two different queries. So we've got the query that's coming in that, I'll show you really quick. We've got the query that's coming in for the specimen type. This is pulling from the database. But we also have, of course, the actual mutation that's happening. So we have the query, which is the specimen picker data, and then we have the add specimen, which is the actual mutation, and those are all getting wrapped together and pushed back out. You have the refetch queries that are happening, which is asking for the, basically underlying it saying refire this query once you have added a specimen, and that will add the addition, that it causes this entire thing to, and this is what's nice about GraphQL. This is a lot more difficult to keep track of when you are dealing with Redux or something along those lines. Here you just say refetch what already happened, refetch a query that's happening someplace else, and it does that, and it'll automatically add the pane and refresh this entire view once you've added something through this mutation. And you can see this is all just the holder data, the form fields, etc., and all of that, and your standard props loading, whatever not. A little bit fancy here. We have some mapping happening with object destructuring, but pretty straightforward otherwise. And of course, some set state, open, change, all of that is covering when the modal's opening or closing. This is similar for the aliquot portion. It's basically very similar code, except it's pulling in a different call for the aliquot picker, obviously, and it looks a little bit different because there's a couple additional fields. Also, I want to give a shout out. I'm trying to remember the name of the library, but I feel like the library that's, look in my code to verify this, but I really like the time picker that it's got. And if you need to make it a little bit more, obvious, but otherwise it allows people to do close clicking with, use their mouse to just pick a time pretty rapidly and go from there. Here I have number of aliquot to create. I think what I'm going to do is actually modify this to just create maximum amount of aliquot button, because I think pretty much that's always going to be the case unless someone tells me otherwise. So that's what's there. And that, of course, is wrapped. The aliquot panel is wrapped someplace else. So this is the specimen panel. Build panes. Build panes has that aliquot info panel, which is being drawn in. And again, it's just mapping through building those panes. Specimen table header is this. The specimen info row is literally just this data that's pulling in, which is pretty straightforward to map as well. And I've already shown you what those kind of look like in other locations, but just in case you don't remember what that looks like, something just straightforward like this, where you're doing that. And then here I guess the only thing interesting about this is we're adding the modal inside this cell right here for nice visual acuity. I actually do have the nice prop types here. I got lazy with prop types as I proceeded coding. I need to go back and add a lot of them. Where were we? We want to look at the aliquot info pane, I believe. Here, similar stuff happening, mapping through all of this, the aliquot to produce the aliquot data. It's going to be a little bit more expansive because you can have multiple aliquot per specimen. And we're wrapping, again, all of this together with nested components all over the place and getting this nice generalized view out. So this entire thing is in specimen page by ID, and that's wrapping both the specimen and the aliquot, and then you have some modals that are nested inside those, and they're each separated out by their own individual components for easier editing and clearer code. And that pretty much covers it. I know that was a bit whirlwind, but I feel like it's still pretty straightforward. None of this is complicated. It's just you've got a lot of individualized components that are being layered together to build this overarching thing. And you can also see where being in this infrastructure makes it a little bit easier to cope with that, because it's like, oh, what am I dealing with? I'm dealing with the specimen info table, so that's going to be concerned with the specimen, all the stuff with specimen in the name perhaps, except for the specimen landing page. Anyway, that just about covers this view. And I need to make mental note that, again, these still need to be edited a little bit with mutations. I feel like I'm debating ditching this altogether and having it work a little bit differently. A few little logic things need to be adjusted, but that's basically it. Not all that complicated, just has a lot as far as components that are being loaded in. But I think that's fairly clear once you have an idea of like, oh, that's not scary. It's just you have these individualized components that are being layered on top of one another. Exactly what you would expect and hope out of an application like this. Anyway, thank you for listening. We will move on, debating what to move on to next. Next, I think we'll take a look at storage setup, which is actually the most complicated portion of the code and also the one I am least happy with. I think initially I will talk about boxes actually first, which are these down here, which is really the end goal of the entire program.